Now that you have Webpack all set up, we can circle back to our original goal, which was to break up our one big file into many small ones. Now, when we're working with React and Webpack, it is a common practice to put each component in its own file. That makes it really easy to scale up your application. So if you add more components, you just add more files. You don't have really long files where it's really hard to search for stuff. Having a component per file makes it easy to maintain those components, update them, and test them. So what we're going to do is close down all of the files except for app.js. Not only am I going to close person and utils, I'm also going to delete them. They were useful when we were exploring import-export, but we no longer need those. So I'm going to trash both of them. Perfect. Now, where are we going to go from here? What we're going to do is we're going to take the old application code. So this is the application that uses components, but they're all in one file. And we're going to take everything from just before the class keyword for indecision app all the way down to the very bottom of the file. So we're going to take all of this stuff, copy it, and paste it over here in app.js, the new file. Now, we're going to be moving all of that stuff out of this file throughout this video, but I do want to start with the working app once again. Remember, we do need to leave React and React DOM in place. These are no longer available as global variables because we removed the script tag. So right here, I will remove all of that, paste in all of the code, and we can just clean up the user component we had created previously. Now we have a working version of our application inside of the Webpack app. So if I save things over here, we can see the indecision app is working. Now the goal is to take all of these components and get them out of this file. We want to keep this file very small. By the end of the video, it's going to be probably 6 lines, maybe 5. And that's what we want. We want all of the components to live in their own location so they can easily be used and reused. The first component that we're going to pull out is the last one we have listed. Way at the bottom, we have add option. We're going to go ahead and create a new file for this one, and we're going to take all of that code and move it over there. Then we'll just export this class and import it here where it's actually used. So what I'm going to do is create a new folder in the source directory, and this one is going to be called components. In here, we're just going to have a bunch of files. We will have one file for each component that makes up our application. So we'll start off with just one for add option. Now, when I'm naming a file for my React components, I give it the exact same name as the component itself, add option. And you notice that I'm also using an uppercase A as the first letter as opposed to a lowercase a. Now, obviously, this is merely a convention. You could also go with add hyphen option or any other variation. The name really isn't important, but I stick with add option for the component files, so it's easy to see exactly which component I'm talking about. Now I'm going to create that file, and step one is to just get all the code over here. So we're going to do that by taking everything from the beginning of the class definition down to the closing curly brace. I'm going to cut it out of this file, but I'm not going to save it because that would break the application. And over in add option, I'm just going to paste it all in. Now, when we do this, we have the code here, but it's not going to work as expected for 2 reasons. 1, we use React, but we don't import it. And 2, we haven't exported anything. So if someone does try to import this file, they're not going to be able to get our class back. Let's go ahead and start off with the easy one, which is to just import React. Import React from React. Perfect. Now, what we're going to do is go ahead and export the class. As we know, there are 2 ways we can export things. We can set up a default export or a named export. For my component files, there's typically just one thing I'm trying to expose, so I will default to the default. Could I use a named export? Sure, that would be perfectly valid, but I'm going to stick with the default since there's really just one big thing I'm trying to let people who import this get access to. So we're going to go ahead and set that up. Now, for export default, we can actually just toss that right before our class definitions. This is something that we saw we couldn't do when creating a constant or any other type of variable, but for class definitions, it's perfectly valid. Now we have our export set up. We can go ahead and save this file, and the only thing we need to do before we save app.js is actually import the new component we just set up. Currently, we are using it, but we've deleted it from this file. So if we did try to run the application, we would get an error. Reference error, add option is not defined. Let's go ahead and actually define it. Up at the top, I'm going to import it. Import. Right here, we are going to import add option. It's the default, so it's not in curly braces, and we're going to grab that from. Then inside of quotes, we just specify the path to that file. app.js.components. Inside of the components folder, we have add-option.js. Now, when we're importing a file that we wrote inside of Webpack, we can actually leave off the .js extension. Webpack is going to automatically look for that, which means that this is perfectly valid, and this is also the format that I'm going to be sticking with throughout the course. So if we save app.js, the program is going to refresh, and this time around, we're going to have a completely valid build, which means that we should see the Indecision app showing up. Right here, we are getting that. Everything is working really well. The add option form is still here, and I can still add stuff to the list. So it has been moved to a separate file, but the functionality is still exactly the same. Everything we had access to before, we still have access to. We've just refactored it, moving it out into its own location. A much smaller file focused on a very specific goal. Now we can go ahead and start working on the other components in this file because there are quite a few. Next up is going to be the option component. So that lives way down below. Option. Right here, this is the one that renders the individual item with the remove button. We're going to go ahead and put this in its own file as well. Inside of the components folder, we're going to make the file for option, uppercase O option.js. And inside of here, we are just going to cut and paste the current code. Now remember, there are still those two things we have to do. We have to import React and we have to export our component. Now this is where usually people get tripped up. They don't see a direct usage of React, so they don't import React. But remember, all of our JSX gets converted into React.createElement calls. So if we don't have React in scope, we're going to get an error if we were to try to run this. I'm going to import React, making sure we do have access to it. And we're going to grab that from React. And then all we need to do is export this by default. Now we know that when we create a variable, we can't just export it by default in line. While this works for class definitions, it's illegal for constant definitions like what we have here. There are two ways we can do this. We could fix this by moving export default down below, or we could just remove the variable altogether using export default directly with our component. And this is going to work, but there is an implication, and I want to talk about that. So I'm going to save option.js, and over inside of app.js, I'm just going to remove these extra lines and make sure to load in option at the very top. Importing option from in the components folder, the option file. Now, if we save things, the application is going to work as expected. Everything looks great. The implication of removing that variable name is something you're only going to see when you crack open the developer tools. So if I go into the React Dev Tools and I open Indecision app and I open options, you can see in here we're getting unknown as the component name instead of the real component name, which is option. Now, why is that happening? Because we don't have a name for this guy. We never created a variable, and that is where React gets the display name for your component. If none is provided, it automatically defaults to unknown. Now this makes the developer tools a little less useful. So we're going to go ahead and try to make sure that we do have valid names for all of ours. I can fix that by setting up that const once again. I'm just going to undo those changes. And I'm going to use export default down below, export default option. This has the exact same effect as what we had previously. The only difference is that we will have the valid component name inside of the React Dev Tools. Here, if I open up options, we are now getting option instead of unknown, which is great. So there we have it. We've successfully converted another component. There are still quite a few left to go though. Now it's your turn to go through that process on your own, and I want you to convert the header component and the action component. So for each one, you are going to create the file, copy the code, and then you're going to set up the import and export values for that file. You're going to do it once for header, then you're going to do it again for action, following the exact same steps we just took for option and add option. Take as much time as you need, and when you're done, test your work. Save all of the files and make sure the application still works as expected, even though the components now live in their own files. No rush at all. Pause the video, and when you're done, click play. All right, we got a pretty good flow down, so we can knock these ones out right here. I'm going to create a new file, header.js, for the header component. I'm going to switch back to app.js and copy all of the code that makes up that component, including the default props. And then I'm going to paste it inside of here. Now I still have to import and export, so I will import up top, importing React from React. And down at the very bottom, I will set up the default export. Export default header. Awesome. Now that we have header in place, we can do the exact same thing for action. I'm going to do that right now by creating a new file in the components folder, action.js. And we're going to toss all of the action component code inside of there. And then I'm going to clean up all of the extra spaces as well as the comments for the challenge. I'm going to paste that in, and all we need to do is set up the export and the import. Export default action, and up at the very top of the file, import React from React. Perfect. Now if we save both of those, we can actually set up the imports, save this file, and we should see the application working once again. I'm going to import action from the file that we just set up in the components folder. It was called action. And I'm also going to import header from, in that components folder, header.js. Awesome. If we save app.js this time around, we should see the application refresh, but we should have the exact same functionality. Over inside of the browser, everything is still working as expected. Now it is actually using these files. If we were to make a change to something over here, it would affect what we see over there. If I toss on some extra ends for indecision, those do indeed show up, and that is just proving that the code it's running is indeed coming from the files that we just created. Now there are just a couple more left. We have two. We have options and we have indecision app. We're going to go ahead and do options together, and it's going to be your job to take care of indecision app at the very end of the video. So what do we need to do for these two guys? For options, not only do we need to take this code and move it over to a new file and set up the imports and the exports, we also have to move one of our imports around. Up at the very top of the file, we have our option component imported, but app.js is no longer going to need that. It's going to be the new options component file that is going to need access to this. So let's go ahead and mess around with that. I'm going to close all the other files, and we're going to create a new one for options. Options.js, and we're going to start off much the same way. We're going to take all of the code. We're going to remove it, and then we'll paste it in over here. And then we're going to import and export. Import React from React, and at the bottom, export default options. Now here's the problem. We are using the option component, but it's not imported in this file. In app.js, we are now importing the option component, but it's not used in this file. So we're going to take the import, cut it out, and paste it over here. Now this alone actually isn't enough because we've actually changed the directory that the import gets called from. So there's no longer a components folder inside of the folder that options is in because options is in the components folder. So we can remove the reference to components. ./option is now the correct path. If I save option.js and I save app.js, we should see the final application. Right here, we are actually getting an error. I forgot to import options. So let's go ahead and knock that out. Now I could have gone ahead and stopped recording and refilmed that to look like a master, but I'm not. Everyone makes mistakes. All we have to do is learn from them. So right here, I'm going to load in the new file we just created. That's going to fix the error, and the end result should be the working app showing up. Fantastic. So there is just one more component sitting inside of app.js. It's going to be your job to get this out of here. It's also going to be your job to make sure that the file you create for indecision app has the correct imports, which is all 4 of these. So just like we moved option from this file over to this file, we want to move all 4 of these from app.js over to indecisionapp.js. So let's go ahead and outline that real quick. We're going to start by moving the component code, and we're going to set up the import export for that new component, and finally we are going to move the imports to that new file and set up an import here. So these are the exact steps we just went through. We're going to move the component code like we moved the options code. We're going to set up the import and export for that new component like we did for every component we've created and shifted so far. And finally, we will just move the imports necessary That's all 4 of these, and we'll include the new import for Indecision app, which is no longer going to live inside of here, even though we are still going to use it. So this line is going to stay exactly the same, and all we're going to do is shift where the code lives. Take some time to knock that one out and then test your work. You should be able to save all the files and see the working application. When you're done, click play. All right, let's go ahead and dive right in. I'm going to start off by moving the component code. I'm going to create the new file where I want to put that code. Indecision app will be the name. Indecision app.js. Inside of here, we're going to take the entire class and shift it over. I'm going to cut all of this stuff out, leaving us with almost nothing in this file, and I'm going to paste it in here. Now we have to go through the usual steps, importing React and exporting this component. I'm going to import React from React, and then I'm going to set this up as the default. Since it is a class, I can just add that in line. Export default class. We're not quite done yet because this file now uses a bunch of components that aren't imported, and this file has a bunch of imports which aren't used. So we're going to go ahead and copy all 4 of these, cutting them out and pasting them up here. Now we do need to change the path, so I'm going to get rid of the components folder for all of them. This file is already in the components folder, so it's not necessary to add that part to the path. It's actually going to break things. Now this file is done. We can save it. And all we have to do is adjust app.js. Right here, we have to import Indecision app. We're going to import the brand new default export we just set up, and we're going to grab that from // This time we do need to go into the components folder since app.js is outside of the components folder. Indecision app.js. Awesome. Now we can remove these comments, and that leaves us with what I promised, a very small app.js file. Here we are just bootstrapping the application. The entire application no longer lives in a single file. Instead, it is spread out across all sorts of files. Now the application just refreshed in the background, and we do still have everything working as expected. So as we can see, it was pretty easy to shift things around. And what we have now is an application that is much easier to visualize, maintain, update, and test. If I want to look at something related to the add option form, I know all of it lives inside of here. So I can crack that open, and I just have to deal with 35 lines of code as opposed to a few hundred, which we had previously. So this is the structure that we're going to be using going forward. Going forward, we're going to leave app.js as a really small file. It should really just be in charge of bootstrapping things that live elsewhere. We're also going to be breaking up our application into many smaller files, not only components, but as we'll see later, other types of files as well. For now, though, we do have what we came here to do. We have a Webpack build set up that is letting us break up our application into small, reusable chunks, which is a fantastic first step. What I'd like to do for the rest of this section is explore some other awesome Webpack features that are going to make development a whole lot easier for you. In the next video, I'm going to show you how to set up source maps, allowing you to easily track down where in your code things are happening. I'm excited to get to that, so stay tuned. I'll see you in the next one.